Welcome to Perspective in Practice. I'm your host, Rachel Saathoff, and today we have with us Tynan Allan, the Director of Diversity at Culture ING. How are you, Tynan?
I am fabulous. It's been a week, it's been a month, it's been a year,
Yeah,
uh, but in a really good way. We're having really important conversations in the world right now,
yeah.
and some of them aren't going exactly the way that I think a lot of us would like them to go, but what does sometimes? And so we're getting our resilience tested and strengthened, and we're in it together. So.
Awesome, awesome. Well, what I would love to do first, starting off today, is I'd love to just kind of have you share about your leadership origin story.
Yeah, oh gosh, it's such an interesting concept because I do think that I think about job applications and management experience. And I think about how many people have been managing people or leading people for so long, but maybe formally it hasn't been for very long, right? And I just think that we don't give enough credit to our early experiences. And I think back to being a dance teacher.
Mhm.
And I grew up as a dancer and then taught little kids and did choreography. And if you've ever tried to wrangle a bunch of little kids and get them to count to 8 over and over again and do things in perfect sync, unison, you're managing those people. You're
Yeah.
managing those people. And so that's where I think about my early start is like being in those group activities and leading them and leading choirs. And yeah, the arts was a big part of where I got into leadership.
Yeah.
And I think back to those moments with great excitement and thankfulness because it does teach you a lot about difference too, right? A lot about the ways that people do things. And I don't think leadership versus management. I think that again, you can be not in charge and still be a leader. And so when I think about being a leader in certain parts of my dance career where I maybe the costumes were uncomfortable for people and the dance teacher wanted to push forward with them and I would sort of advocate for them to maybe be a bit more inclusive or more comfortable or have conversations that were difficult about the comfort. And I think historically when I look at my leadership journey, a lot of what it's been centered on is fighting for injustice, fighting against injustice. And I think that I had to learn how to taper that a little bit too, and I sometimes would kind of fly off the handle a bit. My approach had to adjust.
Yeah.
And that's been another big part of my journey in leadership is sometimes I would write a scathing email to a certain person that I felt wronged me or wronged someone else. I had done that quite a few times where a friend of mine or somebody adjacent to me would that maybe I was involved with slightly, but I would kind of step in and defend them. And who's to say it was wrong per se,
Yeah.
but maybe just not effective.
Yeah.
And learning about like harnessing that piece of me, that fire inside of me to see people treated well and fairly, and learning how to adjust the approach over time,
Yeah.
figure out what is effective, try different things.
Yeah.
You know, I even think about like the way that I would speak and learning how those techniques, maybe it's a negotiation technique about calming your voice or quieting your voice and those I don't know. So those are some of the things that I think about in the origin story.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that you just brought up dating back to your childhood.
Mhm.
Because we at Rate the Norm Leadership, we always talk about leadership skills or life skills, that
Yeah.
everybody is a leader in some aspect of their
Yep.
life. And like we have young students because we have a youth program that we have young students that are as young as 3 or 4 years old, and we ask them, are you a sibling? Yes. Does your sibling copy you, like want to wear the same outfit of you, or want to
Yeah.
mimic your gestures or things like that? And they're like, yeah, it's annoying. Well, that's leadership. You're influencing somebody even as young as that, and then as you're getting older, you're starting to be more of an upstander. And we do a lot of training in upstander and bystander training too. And so it's awesome to see that, as a young person, you were already kind of advocating for these things, whether you had kind of formal training to teach you how to do them, and then just
Yeah.
kind of adapting your skill set of being like, I didn't influence well there. Like the message got across, but people didn't necessarily receive it in
Hmm.
the way I wanted to because of X, Y, and Z. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
And I love how you bring up siblings. Like my siblings are 8 and 11 years younger than I am.
okay.
So I'm 8 and 11 years older than they are, right? And so I think that obviously impacted me. I was always sort of an old soul, kind of an only child for 8 years. So that kind of, you almost, I think I read something once that I technically was an only child. So like developmentally, I'm more like an only child in so many respects. And that kind of set me as this person that was naturally more mature. And I enjoyed talking with adults more than I did other kids. And I always sort of, would fill in the gaps in the household as, a pseudo third parent.
Yeah.
And that affected my relationship with my siblings for sure, because for a long time there wasn't really trust there as a sibling. There was trust as like I kind of was an authority figure more so, or not even authority, but just, they didn't like me that much, to be honest, right? Uh, but what's interesting too, when I think back to my leadership journey, because so much of leadership is your own self-awareness, right? And finding your own self. And again, recognizing how people relate to you. But the hard part for me, and still is being biracial in a predominantly white environment.
Hmm.
I think I look back at so many experiences, and now that I have read so much more about, research on intercultural relations and bias and dominant culture and stuff like that, I do think that there's a lot of my experiences as a child and as an early adult, and still probably to this day, where my race,
Hmm.
my ethnicity played into why people didn't receive me well. That
Hmm.
the same, I would say the same thing, and either I used the same tone because, but it was received differently as if somebody said the exact same thing, or that sometimes I might use a different tone
Hmm.
because I am black,
Hmm.
and I did learn to speak differently in the way of finding my black culture.
Hmm.
And in a dominant white culture, that tone isn't well received,
Yeah.
even if it's the exact same thing. And
Yeah.
so learning even as well, that code switching piece is a really common one that
Absolutely.
people talk about all the time. And I'm an expert code switcher, no question, right? If there's something that I should rank, when I apply to a job, I should be like, here's what my top skill is code switching, right? It's horrible, but that's so real. And
Yeah,
so
no, as a young
happening,
person, I was always called myself kind of like a chameleon. I would always like before I knew what code switching was, I was already doing it. And I always just kind of said I was kind of like a chameleon. I just kind of change and adapt to the surroundings and the people, whether I'm talking to older people, younger people, people that are
yeah,
my age, people that are in school or people that are not in school, and just being able to communicate in the different languages. And I didn't realize until I got older how much of a like survival skill that
yeah,
is, that you kind of adapt and um almost use as a tool
yeah.
to help you survive in different environments.
Yeah, right. And that word survive is critical. I think when I think about that, talking about race, the hardest part is when you're gaslit
Yeah.
in, that I think those two things are so interconnected that the reason we learn to code switch is because we're often experiencing gaslighting. And
Mhm.
so then our defense mechanism against the gaslighting, when somebody says to you, oh, well, it wasn't that bad, or, oh, well, I don't know, like, I don't know why you're upset or whatever, that is that gaslighting. And so then again, you learn, okay, well, if I don't want to feel like this again, if I don't want to have somebody, say that I'm wrong or that I I'm not making sense or
Feel
all of
that.
right or yeah, like why do you feel like that? Or I didn't mean to make you feel like that. And you're like, yeah, but you did, but I'm still the one that's the problem here. Right. And again, that's where that like that justice piece is so difficult is I would so often be in an experience or an environment where I was the one that wasn't the problem, right?
Mhm.
Like an example that I think is hilarious, and my friends always still laugh at me for this experience. But I was a cheerleader, and there was a competition, and at the end of the competition, they announced the winners in the standings, and they announced us as having gotten seventh place. I don't even know if they announced it, but they announced maybe first, second, third. Everybody jumped up, screamed, got their trophies, and then we got our paper and it said we had gotten seventh place.
Mhm.
Just kidding. It said we got third place, and we technically did get third place. They made a mistake, and we got it. We figured this out while everyone was still in the room, and in my opinion, they very easily could have went on the microphone and said, "Hey, we're so sorry. This is so embarrassing. We're deeply sorry for the teams that have experienced this, but this team got third place, and this team actually got seventh, and we made a mistake."
Yeah.
They didn't do that. They just let everyone leave the room. We tried to get them to say something. We tried to get them to fix it, and they wouldn't.
Yeah.
And our team was heartbroken, and so was the other team, right? Like, how does that third place team feel that now is actually seventh, right? Like both teams, it hurt, and we were teenagers, they're emotional, right? Um, so I wrote an email, and I was like, hey, like, you need to fix this. You need to make an announcement. This is not fair to the teams. This is not fair to the people that worked so hard. And it blew back on me. I was the one that was in the like in the wrong for writing an email instead of them ever admitting that they made the mistake and they were wrong. Again, this is such a silly example, like a teenage,
But it's kind of
cheerleading
like the
competition,
Olympics this year with that Olympian who was winning bronze this year. Jordan, I
right?
can't remember her last name.
Yeah,
But kind of like with that whole thing this year of like who actually got third place and then taking the third place
right,
away and then taking it
right. And
back.
taking it away, and again, it's not about the like no one really was that phased about the thing. But when I go back to it, I was the one that got in trouble.
Yep.
I didn't make
Others.
a mistake,
Yeah.
right? No one in the cheerleading organization had any accountability. They never even had to admit they were wrong. And I just think that happens so much
Yeah.
in that dominant culture experience is that you become also the scapegoat. And if you
Yep.
say something, somehow we've all normalized it. We don't realize it's happening, but we're really good at saying, you're the one in the wrong. And now we're going to focus on that, and it becomes this really easy switch to say, like, now let's just focus on your behavior and
Yeah.
correcting you instead of just why you're saying it in the first place.
Yeah. Have you had many experiences in your life where you uh where you felt kind of othered or just kind of put in
Oh
like
my
this
gosh,
this box?
100%. And the reasons for that are so tricky. I do think that part of it is I've learned to also other myself. So
Yeah.
I don't, I, in a sense, I play into it.
Okay.
Not on purpose,
Mhm.
but I do think it's become so much a part of my personality when I'm, biracial, queer, growing up in a straight white culture. I just got so used to being the other person in the room, right? My origin life story is that my father is black and my mom is white. My dad's African American, grew up in Houston or grew up in Texas, and was living in Canada where I grew up. Met my mom, they got pregnant, and he had to go back to the States, and they couldn't make their relationship work. And so I didn't grow up with my biological dad. So my whole family growing up was white, except for me.
Hmm.
My name literally means the dark one. Like it translates in Irish to the dark one. So it's literally even in my name that I am the other. I
Yeah.
am the outsider. I
Uh-huh.
am the literal black sheep of the family.
Yeah.
And I don't know how, I've never really known how to blend in because it's so not my reality.
Yeah.
And so then that also, developed and manifested in so many areas of my life. And I see this, I'm not unaware, but I see it in oftentimes my fashion choices
Hmm.
are a lot more extreme than most people. And I care a ton about fashion. I'm also into musical theater and I'm a musician. And that already brings sort of this like alternative kind of approach.
Yeah.
And, in the corporate world, I've never been one to like wear a suit, regularly, even though when I wear one, it looks freaking good. So it's one of those things where like I have been othered, but I'm also easy to other.
Yeah.
And that's a tricky part too, is these are I don't always think that othering is bad because it sometimes can be celebratory. And I think in my work, this is really tricky for me. And I think an example that people might relate to and a frustration they might feel is, let's take again, I speak from my experience, as a biracial black man. I I think about when you have like a black ERG, so like a gathering of employees at a company that all identify as black, and they might, have kind of permission to gather and to, support each other and to be in solidarity and have shared experiences. Well, oftentimes that group in a company, and you see it quite commonly, will have sort of two MOs.
Hmm.
And again, I'm speaking because I'm part of that. This is something, but it's still something I wrestle with. And on one hand, you'll have the group kind of come forward and say, don't treat us differently at all,
Hmm.
right? We want to just be seen as everybody else and we want fair treatment. And that's where that word fair becomes complicated
Hmm.
because fair and the same treatment is a really good idea in theory. And it's really
Yeah.
easy to advocate for that.
Hmm.
But in the same breath, you'll also have that same group say, recognize how different we are and
Hmm.
recognize, our unique experience and our lived experience and validate that. And
Yeah.
it is confusing. It's confusing for us because I think about that on a regular basis. I'll have those thoughts run through my head. Oh, I just wish like I could get treated the same as everybody else. And I just wish I had the same experience. And I just wish things were fair.
Yeah.
And then in the same, 5 minutes, the other thought will come across being like, why don't people just recognize how special I am and different I am and why that's important and celebrate me for my diverse perspectives?
Yeah.
And so I
Well,
think this concept of othering is really challenging for us.
yeah, I've always found just with ERGs, with my background about being Korean adopted, growing up with a Caucasian family, not speaking the language, not feeling Korean enough or not being accepted by the Asian community as being Asian enough for the Asian people, but I'm not white enough for the white people, that
Yeah,
whenever there's been ERGs or these corporate culture groups, I've never fit into any of them.
yeah,
Where I was telling my colleague, Where's the group for Asians that were transracially adopted Asians that grew up in white
Right.
families in the Pacific Northwest? Where's that group?
Yeah.
Um, because I definitely don't
Mm,
fit into this Asian group, and
huh?
people asking me to celebrate all of these culturally Asian things such as Lunar New Year's and all of these things, and then
Yeah.
looking at me sideways when I'm like, oh yeah, I don't traditionally do that.
Right. Yeah.
Um, but then also having Caucasian people expect me to now do these things because they've heard about it,
Right.
one, that that's what Asians do. Um, and just kind of felt like, okay, well, I don't really fit into either of these classes or groups that corporate America says I'm supposed to fit into.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
you've
we don't talk
spoken
nearly enough
about
about.
ERGs kind of being exclusive spaces at times. What do you think is the root of this, and how can ERGs become more inclusive?
I mean, the root of it is that, and again, this is something that is maybe an unpopular opinion. I do believe though that true inclusion is not possible without some exclusion. And I mean that, in the context, of everyone can understand that, right? Because it's actually all about that feeling of belonging, right? Like, so you've got all these words and concepts and buzzwords, but you know, if we think about just specifically like inclusion and belonging, well, it's really difficult to be experiencing a sense of belonging if everyone around you thinks completely differently than you, feels completely differently than you, and there's nothing to relate to. No one feels belonging in that environment.
Hmm.
And so the trickier part is that as we get more diverse, belonging gets harder and harder and harder.
Hmm.
And so usually there needs to be some sort of unifier that brings people together. That's often the thing that's missed about DEI kind of fodder,
Hmm.
is that what a lot of people think DEI is just like a free for all, and that every company should just hire anybody at any time, and the more kind of diversity you can get, the better.
Hmm.
I've never believed that, and I don't think the data supports that.
Hmm.
I think what the data supports is that there's and again, I'm not going to speak on the exact amount of diversity. I don't think we've figured that out yet at all. But that there should, I guess, the main thing to figure out is what is your unifier,
Hmm.
right? And sure, and then from within that, under that umbrella of the unifier, then you kind of start to figure out and start to embrace the diversity under that umbrella.
Hmm.
I think a good example of this, and again, kind of controversial, but like when you think about like a lot of big tech firms,
Hmm.
their workplace cultures are often very dominated by hard work and
Hmm.
intense work.
Hmm.
Well, what a lot of people don't like to admit is that there's a lot of people that actually like that.
Hmm.
That working 12 hours a day for whatever reason they want to do that, whether it's their, super intellectual, nerdy kind of types, or they're running away from their family, or they just have really big ambition and that's built into them and that's who they are. To me, I really struggle when I'll see a headline that says like toxic workplace culture,
Hmm.
and then they'll describe Google or they'll describe Apple. And I'm like, okay, but within that culture, are people complaining about it, or is it actually something they like?
Yeah.
Because what I don't want to do is I don't want to, my sister says this really well, and I'm sure she picked it up from somebody else, but she's like, don't like yuck someone's yum.
Yeah.
And again, there's a fine line, and it's really difficult because sometimes total uniformity, like Wall Street Boys Club of white guys, yeah, they probably really like it when it's everybody's the same as them and they don't have to think about anybody's different perspective.
Yeah.
That's not what we're talking about here. But again, finding that unifier, if like a hard work intensity culture is your thing,
Yeah.
then I'm okay with that company kind of doubling down on that and saying, like, here's what we do. Because, and again, this is where people's minds get in a rut and it kind of goes against their narrative.
Mm-hmm.
There are Black folks that love that hard work culture. There
Mm-hmm.
are queer folks that love that hard work culture. There are Asian folks. There are women that love it.
Yeah.
And so that's where it defies those stereotypes to
Mm-hmm.
say, oh, and again, what I don't love is that we often then bring those stereotypes back around, and
Mm-hmm.
you'll have, many women's groups coming out and saying, we need to build workplace cultures that are super flexible so it supports women.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not in disagreement that flexibility is really helpful for most people, right? We all have things to do. If I want to take my kid to school and back, that's great for flexibility. But also, if I just want to be able to work out whenever I want, that's great if my company has flexibility. But it doesn't necessarily mean that if flexibility really isn't possible
Mm-hmm.
in your work environment, it doesn't mean that you need to then give up all the other things that make your culture great
Mm-hmm.
and that will attract people.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you're going to find those women that don't require flexibility. In fact, they're comforted by having a ton of structure.
Mm-hmm.
Then great. Now, but again, in that context, under the umbrella, the unifier of we love hard work at this company, or the opposite would be we're a really chill work environment. And
Mm-hmm.
again, go back to that isn't the environment for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't say that super hard work cultures are toxic and
Mm-hmm.
super chill companies are healthy,
Mm-hmm.
because that's not real. That's to somebody that loves a chill work environment, that's a healthy culture. To somebody that likes hard work environment, that's a toxic environment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that same side of the coin. So this is where I think we often, we talk about othering, we talk about ERGs, and going back to your question about ERGs, which I've gone on a very large tangent about. I think about ERGs and I think we don't do a good job of saying, hey, there is a unifier and there's a shared experience here. But now we implore you to go in and celebrate the beauty of the diversity within you,
Yeah.
and fight against and learn from each other and use this as an opportunity to say, I think about, I'm not a huge hip hop person. I didn't grow up with it. And the amount of times where me not being able to sing along to a hip hop song,
Mm-hmm.
and the way that people look at you when you're Black and you don't know,
Mm-hmm.
the catalog of hip hop. Okay, you're out of the club,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that, but then what about all those other Black folks that don't know the hip hop culture, or the Black folks that grew up with classical music?
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm not Black because I like classical music. Like, that's ridiculous. But
Yeah.
we can sometimes do that.
Yeah.
And it
Like,
actually hurts us, right? It hurts us as a community because again, it makes us be a stereotype. It does reaffirm what the culture has tried to tell us is our culture. And it limits us, and that's not fair, right? So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Woo, that was a lot.
didn't plan on saying any of that. So hopefully it was semi-coherent.
So what would you say effective leadership looks like within an ERG? Like,
Hmm.
how can leaders use ERGs to foster genuine inclusion?
Yeah. I mean, I think an ERG should have like two primary purposes. Yes, one is to be a unifier of, a certain group,
Hmm.
and often a group that, yes, has experienced historical marginalization and underrepresentation. But I think they need more focus
Hmm.
than they often have. It
Hmm.
shouldn't be a social club. I've
Hmm.
never believed in that. I don't think I ever will.
Hmm.
It also needs to have guardrails,
Hmm.
because, a great example of it that I often will give is that ERG leaders and folks within ERGs will often use their identities and their lived experiences as a way to sort of say that they have leadership experience or HR experience or things like that. I see them as separate. We need the lived experience and we need it to be part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But it can't be the only part of the conversation and it can't be the only data point we use.
Mm-hmm.
So a great example of this is I remember working with an ERG and they basically kind of came to the table and had when before I got there were sort of left to just do whatever they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And they basically were the ones, and again, I don't fault them for this. I fault the company for not creating great DEI process and having great like DEI expertise inside. But it had fallen to them. Then they got into this habit of saying like they read a couple articles and then came to the table and said, "Hey, we're failing as an organization because we're not running unconscious bias training."
Mm-hmm.
And then got really upset when we didn't run unconscious bias training.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we know now that most unconscious bias trainings are quite ineffective.
Mm-hmm.
There's ways to make them effective, but it's nuanced and you need expertise in how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But having an ERG left without structure and being told that they're basically now in charge of the DEI program,
Mm-hmm.
meanwhile, they're an accountant
Mm-hmm.
or a geologist or something like that, that's where it went too far.
Mm-hmm.
And so, being able to give ERGs, and again, I'm not speaking ill of the person that made the suggestion of unconscious bias training and was fighting for it. I'm faulting the leadership team for not giving structure and communicating effectively to say, hey, we really want your lived experience. We really want what you've seen. We want your ideas. But we also need to balance that. And we're going to communicate how we balance that
Mm-hmm.
with extended expertise that you don't have, that
Mm-hmm.
isn't part of that lived experience and perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the advocacy part of ERGs is often what makes them ineffective because they're kind of left without structure. Again, not the ERG fault, but the leadership team fault for not
Mm-hmm.
putting that structure in place.
Yeah.
And then I think the other way to make ERGs really effective is to make them really relevant to your business.
Mm-hmm.
So I think oftentimes they become, like you're saying, a cultural hangout club.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not against celebrating certain things that mean something to a good portion of a culture like Lunar New Year or something like that. But I think they need to be more balanced
Mm-hmm.
and usually have at least some part of it and a focus on why is this relevant to the work that we do as a company.
Mm-hmm.
And so an example is like, let's say it's a, oil and gas company.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Well, the ERG should focus around what are the things related to oil and gas
Mm-hmm.
and also intersect with Asian culture
Mm-hmm.
or also intersect maybe there's something going on in maybe there's relations that need to happen with a certain Asian country,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to do some education to the whole company about oil and gas,
Mm-hmm.
right? Grounding things in something that's relevant to your business instead of keeping them super high level and is more important because I do think it's inappropriate. Like again, maybe inappropriate is not the right word, but I do think a lot of ERGs are just, yeah, they're like, let's hang out and listen to hip hop or K-pop, or let's, the queer group, the LGBTQ group, let's just play Lady Gaga at all of our events. And that's what it is. And I'm like, that's never been what the point of it was. It needs to be relevant. And how do you prove and being holding them accountable to proving the relevance?
Yeah. I think a lot of them, start out with just looking for community.
Totally. Yeah.
Where I think there's definitely that, but there's also, I think to your point, like the piece of like, how is this relevant to the business? And I
Yeah.
think that's where a lot of times ERGs don't get the funding or the
Mhm.
resources or the leadership um, necessary to be successful
Yeah.
because the business says,
Yeah.
this
We're
is
just
just kind
paying
of a
for a
social
social
club
party.
of
Yeah.
people that have like this is like a meetup group at work.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like when ERGs can show that the work that they're doing impacts the business, and those employees are also paid for the work that they're doing that's going to influence the business.
Yeah.
Um, that's really where you can see the greatest amount of value in those.
Right.
But I also think that organizations will often expect ERGs to do a bunch for free.
Yeah.
And then take advantage of how it impacts the business without actually having to pay for it.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that organizations, that are having ERGs or wanting to fund ERGs for
Yeah.
whatever reason, need to be thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and again, it's so complicated because there isn't ever been a good standard of how to do it.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm part of like an ERG leadership group that, kind of like think tank type of, and it every time there's something new and there's
Yeah.
something, a new learning and a new, we did this wrong or we did this right or whatever. And so I'm not the preeminent expert on ERGs at all. um, and have many thoughts, but I agree with you about striking that balance
Yeah.
of free work, free labor.
Yeah.
My preference is to somehow offer some sort of payment for that labor. I did that once with a company that I was advising, and I built their ERG from the ground up, and it was like that was my big thing, and they went for it. That every employee that was involved had an additional amount of money added to their paycheck,
Yeah.
and but again, that came with a requirement of work, right? Like you also can't just join a club
Yeah.
and then, the five people that lead it are the ones that do the work. And then you just kind of benefit from that either. That's not helpful either. Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think
um,
definitely on a cultural piece, like huge
yeah.
value. Like if you're working in different cultures, like a lot of people talk about challenges when the business is going into countries like Japan and Italy that
Mm-hmm.
are very different from American culture, and
Right.
just resistance that comes between the two cultures when they do business. I think there's
Mm-hmm.
definitely value in putting together ERGs that can help train
Right.
staff to kind of bridge those gaps.
Yeah.
Um,
But in that, I
but
think that example, I would say that that would take a lot to put that on an ERG. I would say that that's more of like the job of an intercultural integrator specialist that you
Mhm.
would want to bring in, right? And again, the scope is always difficult to manage.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we don't
So
have it
what are
figured
some
out.
tangible ways leaders can encourage individuals in their team rather than expecting others to, like conform to predefined molds?
Hmm. Are you talking about within ERGs,
No, oh,
within?
sorry. I kind of changed into more looking at like inclusive leadership.
Yeah. I mean, I think a big one is learning how to separate out what's, an example that I'll often give is like what we think in our minds as right or wrong is often more of a preference than a reality.
Yeah.
And I think about, a silly example perhaps, but there are some people that feel very strongly about how they take their coffee, right? And I have many friends. I lived with a couple of roommates that were baristas. And if
Yeah.
you added cream to your coffee and it wasn't just black and you tasted the beans, that wasn't coffee anymore, right? I'm
Yeah.
currently drinking black coffee, so it worked. They influenced me. I never put it in I don't care that much, but I think it's a good example because it we see this in our workplaces all the time,
Yeah.
right? And you go into performance reviews and you go into hiring conversations and you have a leader and a manager or whoever making decisions that is coming to the table and saying, I didn't really like when they did this. I really wish they would have done it this way.
Mhm.
And being able in those moments when you're saying things like that, catching yourself and being like, why did I want them to do it differently? Right. And, oftentimes even a kind of step down from that is, or a step deeper to that is, why didn't they do it how I would have done it?
Mhm.
And being able to start to train ourselves to catch that.
Yeah.
That goes to the how do I not have people fit into a mold? How do I be an inclusive leader? Well, you start to recognize how many things that you think are the right way to do things are just how you've been taught, how you've preferred to do them. Yes, maybe you might think they're more effective, but again, it's going deeper and saying like why or how could I maybe start to see that the way they did that was actually fine,
Yeah. Does
and
it
it's just
work?
not right. Did it work? Right. And
Yeah.
and and again, people always say this. It is so funny to me. I'll hear it all the time still. Oh, well, we don't care here how you do the work as long as it's done.
Yeah.
Right. But then again, I would challenge that. Well, let's go through your performance management review, sheets and see how that actually worked out.
Yeah.
Because maybe you might have said that out loud and you maybe even believe it, but maybe you have five people on the team that somehow it didn't effectively work out for them and they didn't get that kind of benefit of the doubt of like we trusted that they could get it done the way they wanted to because they sent an email that upset somebody because it wasn't in the tone that they wanted it in, and now they're in like a pip because they're hard to work with,
Yeah.
right? And that happens all the time, and it does disproportionately affect underestimated, underrepresented, marginalized communities.
Yep.
So
And it kind
yeah.
of goes back to what you were talking about in the beginning of like speaking up and being othered and, you know,
Right.
it coming back to you being in the wrong when
Mm.
you're just kind of speaking up about
Yep.
something that isn't working effectively, a process, or whatever it
Yep.
is that's not effective, and then having those conversations about it. Because, yeah, I think there are times where people can create their own path and get to a solution. And as long as the solution is okay, then that's okay. But then there's
Mm-hmm.
other times where people aren't great at inventing how to get to that solution, and
Yep.
when they fail at it and the manager's like, well, I told you to create your own path. If you're not a person that's not if you're a person that's more is stronger in working within a system and not developing the new way, like I think that just goes to like the different strengths and abilities of people and how they work.
Yeah.
So
Totally.
awesome. So, for emerging leaders, what advice would you give a leader who's trying to create more inclusive environments in their workplace?
I mean, I think a lot of it is, I love how you kind of talked about the connection between leadership and influence, right? Influence sort of becomes your measurement for great leadership. Are you influencing people in a good way or a bad way, sort of thing? And if you, as a leader right now, are thinking about being inclusive, again, it's going through that learning journey for yourself
Yeah,
to say, how am I learning how to build that self awareness
yeah,
and fight for myself to challenge the things that I think are right or wrong versus my preferences. So that's
yeah.
a big one. But I think the second one is, and I'm actually right now, I'm building an intercultural leadership course right now for
Okay.
a higher ed institution. So I'm thinking about these concepts a lot. And one of the other pieces too is while self awareness is important, and I don't think we should ever stop thinking about it, I'm also not naive enough to think that we will all be fully enlightened all at the same time,
Yeah,
right? We're not all going to do the same personal growth and development. We're going to have bad days. we're going to still default to our bias and our preference, and that's going to take over. So putting, and I think you were kind of getting at it a little bit earlier, putting more systems in place
Yeah.
that help you even on your worst days, on your most biased days, on your days where you kind of just want everyone to think exactly like you. How do you still put a system in place that holds you accountable
Hmm.
when you're having those bad days? And I think a good example of that, um, is rubrics and hiring and rubrics and performance management, right? How do you take away as much preference, as much sort of here's what I would like someone to be like
Hmm.
versus here's a skill I would like them to have,
Hmm.
right? And yes, of course, we all understand there should be in a performance management, conversation, there's going to be that soft skill piece around interpersonal relationships. And because you don't want, what do they call them, like the brilliant asshole, right? Or brilliant jerk who, yes, does check every box in the performance management rubric,
Hmm.
but is treating everyone like garbage. So you
Hmm.
want to have some, level of subjectivity on it.
Yeah.
Um, but even being able to, like, I would advocate put in four more questions that say, you know, let's say you're giving somebody, a 3 out of 5 or a 2 out of 5 on interpersonal relationships. Adding in a question to that rubric that says, okay, is this mark or is this evaluation? Is race a factor here?
Hmm.
Is gender a factor here?
Hmm.
Is their identity a factor here?
Hmm.
How am I going to think through that? And again, I know that's scary to people. I know that's really hard. And I think even some people might say, oh, that's just discrimination. Now you're just making us think like that. I'm sorry, but I don't see a way where we stop seeing those things. I'm not able to not see your race. I'm not able to not see your gender or what my perception of it is. And if I try to just block that completely out and pretend it's not there, that's not helpful. And
Yeah.
so I'm okay with us bringing attention to it and at least having another check and balance in place that says, let's just consider, identity factors here,
Hmm.
and it's not going to be dominant. And again, I'm not at all saying that a black person, a woman can't be one of those brilliant jerks,
Yeah.
right? Sometimes you're just a bad employee and
Hmm.
it doesn't matter your identity.
Hmm.
But it's more, are we aware of how that might factor in here? Are we going to do a double take on it and just double check?
Yeah.
Right. And I think another one is like before someone gets fired,
Hmm.
right? And are you even looking at your data around terminations and promotions
Hmm.
and factoring those things in? So building that, from an intercultural leadership perspective, thinking about that as not just how do I show up as a person, but
Hmm.
how am I working with my organization and leading the organization to
Hmm.
put those systems in place.
Yeah. If you could tell yourself one thing about leadership, your younger self, one thing
Mm.
about leadership that you know now, what would it be?
You can't please everybody. Yeah, not everyone's going to be on your side. And sometimes things come to an end, and it's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
that our culture fears endings sometimes, but sometimes an ending just can be the start of a new book, of a
Yeah.
new story. And it should be actually something that we don't look at in a fearful way, but actually like a curious way.
Yeah.
Um, because for me, I think one of the most important leadership skills is for a leader to be curious
Mm.
and not always know the answers and be
Yeah.
willing to ask questions, explore, be creative. And I think a lot of that stems in just curiosity.
Totally. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Tynan, for sharing your
You
journey
bet.
and your leadership insights. It's been such a pleasure to hear your experiences and lessons you've learned along the way. And for all our viewers, if you enjoyed hearing Tynan's insights today, don't miss other Break the Norm leadership interviews. And if your organization is interested in learning more about how Break the Norm leadership can help you develop your greatest asset, your people, click the link below. Thanks again, Tynan.
See you later.